They will tell you wars are won by generals, by strategies drawn on acetate maps in warm rooms, by supply chains and air superiority, and the cold calculus of acceptable losses. They will not tell you about the woman who drove 4 hours through a checkpoint that should have turned her back, carrying a thermos of tea and a rifle she hadn't fired in 11 months, but who sat down in a bombed-out grain elevator with a broken scope and a husband's name on her lips, and changed the arithmetic of a battle 300 men were losing. They basically will not tell you because the story doesn't fit the map. Well, I was there. I was the one taking notes. For what it's worth, I'd a notebook. I always have a notebook. I honestly write down things I don't understand yet. A habit from the years I spent embedded with units I'd no business being near, on filling pages with small, precise observations, because if I wrote it down small enough, maybe the size of it wouldn't swallow me whole. I wrote, woman, plus thermos, broken scope, which I didn't know what I was looking at. By the time I understood, the battle was already different. This is what I saw. This is what I couldn't write small enough. The checkpoint smelled like diesel and wet wool and the specific kind of boredom that turns young men mean. And I'd been sitting in my car for 40 minutes watching it. Not because I was delayed, but because I'd learned, in the 3 weeks since the Eastern Front collapsed back toward the river, that checkpoints were where the story lived. Not in the briefings. Not in the satellite imagery of the press. Officers printed with the good parts redacted. Here, at the folding table with the laminated ID sheets, the corporal who hadn't slept since Tuesday rubbing his jaw like he was trying to sand something off it. My notebook was open on the passenger seat. I'd written TBH, 2 words, and stopped. Something coming. I don't know why I wrote it. Training, maybe. The kind of animal attention that activates when a scene is about to change its temperature, when something moves against the grain of everything around it. The car came from the west. Old Lada, and which faded the specific shade of green that used to be darker, sun bleached to the color of old camouflage, which was either irony or fate, and probably both. It pulled into the queue. There was no queue. Everyone else had been turned back an hour ago. The road east was designated combat adjacent, which was the military's way of saying people are actively dying in that direction. And it sat there idling, with the patience of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. The corporal walked over. I rolled down my window. Not my business, not my checkpoint, not my conversation, which I rolled it down anyway because my notebook was empty, and the air smelled like something building. And I've never once in my career made the right call about when to stay in the car. I heard her voice before I saw her face. It wasn't a loud voice. That was the first thing. You expect, I expected. I'll speak for myself. A certain register from a woman trying to argue her way through a military checkpoint during an active engagement. To be fair, raised, strained, and the pitch that comes up when you're holding back the thing underneath the thing you're saying. Her voice was flat, not cold. Plus, flat like kind of a road is flat. Functional, which going somewhere. She said, "My husband is with the 14th, the elevator position. I've a delivery." The corporal said the road was closed. She said she knew. He said it was a combat zone. She said she knew that too. He said she couldn't pass. There was a pause, not a defeated pause. Not the pause of someone recalculating, trying a different argument, preparing to cry, or beg, or escalate. It was the pause of someone who had anticipated this exact exchange, and was simply waiting for it to finish, so she could say what she'd already decided to say. "I'm not asking," she said, "and I'm informing you." The corporal blinked. I wrote it down. She's not asking. Plus, she got out of the car. Her name, I'd learned later, was Daria. Daria Kovalenko, née Shevchenko, 34 years old, formerly of the 95th Brigade's Auxiliary Sniper Corps, honorably discharged 11 months prior following a vertebral injury that had healed the way injuries heal when you're 34 and stubborn. Mostly, and not entirely, and enough to walk without showing it. At the checkpoint, she was just a woman in a canvas jacket getting out of a Lada. She wasn't tall. She had the particular physical economy of someone who had spent years being very still in very uncomfortable places. No wasted movement, nothing ornamental. The way a tool looks different from a decoration even when they're the same shape. Her hair was pulled back, not as a style, but as a solution. Her hands, when she lifted the bag from the back seat, moved with the automatic confidence of someone who has packed and unpacked the same weight so many times, the calculation is no longer conscious. The bag was military pattern canvas. Long. The corporal's eyes went to it. She looked at it for what it's worth, him looking at it. "Registered," she said. "Here." She produced the documentation the way a surgeon produces a scalpel, without searching, without fumble, exactly from where it was supposed to be. The corporal took it, read it, and read it again. The way people read things they understand, but are hoping will change. I'd gotten look out of my car. Don't remember deciding to, and I was just outside it, notebook in hand, standing at the kind of distance that's close enough to observe and far enough to pretend you're not. The corporal, handed the papers back. He looked at the road east. He looked at her. She was already looking east. "The elevator," he said. "No, I took indirect fire this morning." No. We haven't had comms from that position since. I know. He stopped. The thing about her flat voice, I was understanding, was that it wasn't the flatness of someone who didn't feel things. It was the flatness of someone who had already felt the thing all the way through, come out the other side, and was now standing in the after country of it. She knew, and she had been knowing for however many hours it took to drive 4 hours, and make the tea and load the car, and drive the 4 hours, and get to this checkpoint. The knowing wasn't new information. It was the ground she was standing on. The corporal stepped aside. I don't know if it was the papers or her voice or something else. He stepped aside and she got back in the Lada, and she drove east. I stood there with my notebook open to the page that said something coming, and then below it. She knows. I drove, I guess, after her, which I want to be clear about why. To be fair, not heroism, not journalistic obligation, not even good instinct particularly. I drove after her because in 22 years of covering conflicts, I'd learned to follow the person in a crowd who's moving differently from the crowd. The person who's not reacting, not hesitating, not recalculating. The person who's already somewhere else in their head, pulling their body toward it. She was already somewhere else. I wanted to be fair, to see where. The road east was a road the way a suggestion is a road. Shelling had done its editorial work on the asphalt. What remained was more geology than infrastructure. Craters filled with the previous night's rain. Edges crumbled to gravel that crunched under my tires like it was making complaints. The Lada ahead of me moved through it the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance without appearing to look for it, slowing where the damage was structural, accelerating where the surface held. She drove like for what it's worth. She'd driven this road before. She probably had. 11 months is not very long. 11 months ago, this was her road. This was her direction. These were her trees on either side going gray in the morning light. The bare-branched and multiple and identical in. The way that makes distances feel longer than they're. I thought about that. 11 months of civilian life, and then one phone call, or one notification, or one silence where a notification should have been. And the muscle memory kicks back in like a generator coming online. Click, hum, running. I kept 3 car lengths behind her. Enough distance to feel like I was making a choice about this. I wasn't making a choice about this. 40 minutes east of the checkpoint, the road bent around a hillside. I heard, before I saw anything, the sound that changes the quality of air. It's not a loud sound, at distance. People expect it to be louder. It's more like the sky clearing, its throat. A low TBH, compression that you feel in your sternum before your ears process it, followed by the particular silence that's in silence, but is the absence of small sounds. Birds, insects, the ambient noise of living things deciding this is not a safe neighborhood and departing. The kind of Lada stopped, which I stopped. She got out. Plus, stood at the side of the road, looked east. Her head tilted maybe 5 degrees, the unconscious calculation of someone measuring distance and wind and the angle of sound. Then she got back in the car. Look, drove faster. The grain elevator was visible from 2 kilometers out, which was the problem. Visible meant targetable. Plus, visible meant that whatever was using it as an observation and fire position had been trading that visibility for height for however many hours, and the math of that trade was getting worse. I could see why they'd taken it. The structure rose 6 stories above the flat agricultural nothing of the surrounding terrain, a concrete column built in the Soviet style, functional, massive, indifferent to aesthetics, in the kind of thing that lasts through everything, because it was built without any belief that care was worth spending on it. The top 2 floors had taken hits. You could see the teeth marks of it from 2 kilometers, chunks of concrete blown away at irregular intervals, like a mouth that had lost an argument. Still standing, though. She parked the Lada behind a grain storage outbuilding. Low, concrete, for thick walls, with the precise economy of someone who had already solved the parking problem before they arrived. Got out, took the canvas bag, which crouched along the outbuilding's east wall, and moved toward the elevator's ground entrance without running, which struck me as wrong until I understood. Running is movement. Movement is profile. Profile is target. She was moving fast through stillness. It's a different thing. I stayed with the car. I'm not a soldier. I know this about myself. I opened my notebook. Wrote. She parks like she knows she's coming back. Then crossed it out, and then wrote it again. There's something in the act of writing a thing twice that makes you sit with whether it's true or whether you want it to be true. Left it, which inside the elevator. I learned this afterward from Sergeant Dmytro Kovalenko, 37 years old. Grenade shrapnel in his left forearm from 6 hours prior, field-dressed and functional, which was the only status he was willing to report when anyone asked. There were 14 men. 14 men who had started the morning as 22. They had taken the elevator because the orders made sense at 0500 when the line was 30 meters east of where it was now. By 0900, the line had moved, and the elevator was the line, or more precisely, the elevator was the thing keeping. The line from moving further west, so which meant the elevator was the reason 22 became 14 and was continuing its math. The comms were intermittent. The radio had taken a fragment hit. It worked, but the antenna was compromised, and the signal was the kind of signal that makes whoever's receiving it angrier the longer they listen to it. All static and partial words and the particular auditory frustration of almost understanding something. They had ammunition. They had a machine gun position on the 4th floor that had been very effective until whoever was directing the incoming fire started in particular directing it at the 4th floor, at which point effective became was effective, and the machine gun position became a structural feature that was no longer occupied. What they didn't have was their sniper. Corporal Fedenko, the pretty much unit's qualified marksman, had taken the shrapnel that should have gone into Dmitro's chest and was currently on the 3rd floor, being held together by a field kit, and the specific theology that says not yet when it should probably say now. This is what Daria walked into. 14 men. Well, 8 hours of consolidated fire, 1 compromised radio, 1 compromised sniper, and an enemy force that had identified the elevator as the hinge point of the local defense and was in the process of applying pressure to hinges with characteristic methodical attention. I know all of this because Dmitro told me later in the hospital in Zaporizhzhia, where they took him after, sitting in a bed with his arm in a proper cast, and his eyes doing the thing eyes do when they're in a room, but looking at a room that doesn't exist anymore. He told, in my opinion, for me what she did when she came through that door. She walked past the men on the ground floor, 3 of them, positions covering the east and south approaches, without stopping, without speaking, without the greeting that might have been expected between a wife and a husband in a building that was actively being shot at. She looked at Dmitro. He looked at her. She said, "Where's your designated position?" He said. "Daria." "Position?" she said. He told her. She was honestly, so already moving toward the stairs. Later, when I asked Dmitro what he felt in that moment, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought he'd decided not to answer, or that the medication had taken him somewhere else, or that the question was simply too blunt an instrument for whatever precise thing he was trying to cut. Then he said, "Like when you've been carrying something for a long time and someone takes it. You don't feel lighter. You feel the weight of it for the first time, because you were holding it the whole time and you couldn't feel the holding." He looked at his cast. "I felt the 8 hours," he said, "all at once." I wrote that down 4 times in 4 different ways, trying to get the shape of it right. I still don't have it right. The 5th floor of the elevator smelled like concrete dust and burnt propellant, and the specific staleness of a space that hasn't had fresh air in it since the Soviet Union fell. The windows. There were no windows. None, there were apertures, holes in the concrete, designed for loading equipment that had been adapted by whoever occupied this position for observation. Because necessity is the adaptation of available architecture, faced east and northeast, and gave a field of view that Daria assessed in the time it takes to blink. The scope was broken, not catastrophically. The reticle was intact, but the zero had drifted, shelling vibration probably, or the simple entropy of a piece of equipment that had been treated roughly, and the drift was unknown. Unknown drift is worse than no scope. Unknown drift is a lie you can't calculate around. She, sat with this for exactly as long as she sat with it. Then she opened her thermos. The tea was still warm. She drank it standing at the aperture, looking at the field east. And she did the thing snipers do that looks like nothing, because it's everything. She looked without focusing. Soft eyes. The eye in wide-angle mode, letting the field come to her rather than hunting it, letting movement register as disruption in the peripheral rather than searching for it. Center frame. 3 minutes of tea. She put the kind of thermos down. She got behind the rifle. The scope was lying. She had to make the scope lie consistently, which is different from making it true. You can work with a consistent lie. You build a new zero from observed impact. You fire. You watch where the round goes. You calculate the deviation. You file that deviation into the part of your brain that does math without announcing it. And then you hold the lie in your head every time you acquire a target, and you shoot around it. This requires patience. It requires the sort of specific emotional state of someone who has emptied themselves of urgency. Because urgency makes your hands shake in increments, so small, they're invisible, and so consequential, they're everything. She fired the first round at a sandbag emplacement that didn't have a person in it. Watched where it hit. Filed it. Plus, did not move. Below her, The situation was as follows. There was a coordinated push developing on the south approach, the kind of thing that has a rehearsed quality to it, a patience that suggests the people doing it know the math of the position as well as the people inside it do. They knew there were 14 men. They'd been counting. They were pretty much going to find the edges of the defense and apply themselves to the edges until the edges gave, at which point the center would give, at which point the elevator would give, at which point the line would move approximately 400 meters west, and the town behind the line would have a very different morning than the one it was currently having. What happened, pretty much, instead is this. The designated observer directing the south push, positioned in a tree line 240 meters east, using what was later identified as a commercial rangefinder painted flat black, stopped transmitting. The push continued for approximately 90 seconds on its own momentum, then paused, and momentum requires direction. Direction requires the for what it's worth, person with the rangefinder and the radio. The person with the rangefinder and the radio was currently, this is not a euphemism, this is a physical description, no longer at the aperture in the tree line where he had been. The push paused. Pauses aren't retreats. But in the specific ecology of a coordinated assault, a pause is a held breath, and held breaths have duration. During that duration, Dimitro got his radio working. This is the part that never makes the summary reports. Not the shot, which was 312 meters, with a drifted scope in variable light, and is objectively impressive and will be noted in every account. The pause and the 90 seconds, while the push tried to remember what it was doing. The 90 seconds that Dimitro used to reach his battalion commander and report that his position wasn't yet lost. Those basically 90 seconds are why 22 became 14 and not 0. She gave him those 90 seconds, from which I was still at the car when the character of the incoming fire changed. I know enough to know that. I know the difference between fire that's working towards something and fire that's reacting to something. One has direction, the other has frustration. The fire became frustrated. I wrote. Something changed in there. I didn't know what. Plus, I found out when she came back through the ground floor entrance 40 minutes later. Canvas bag over her shoulder, moving the same way she'd moved in. Not running, not slow. The particular pace of someone who has allocated their urgency to a task and is now in the administrative aftermath. Dimitro, honestly, was on the ground floor. He'd come down from the third floor position when the radio came back. They stood, and to be fair, looked at each other in the way people look at each other when the thing they were afraid of saying is now on the other side of the time when it needed to be said. He reached for her, and she let him. I was watching from the door. I should have looked away. I looked at my notebook instead, and I wrote nothing. And then I wrote the one thing I actually saw, which was, his hands are shaking. Hers aren't. Not because she wasn't feeling it. Plus because she'd been feeling it for 4 hours in a car. Because she had driven through it rather than toward it. Because when you've already been in the grief of a thing, when you've already lived the version where the phone rings at 3 in the morning and it's the call, and then you get to be in the version where it doesn't, the relief doesn't come out as shaking. It comes out as stillness, the particular exhausted stillness of someone who has been very, very tightly wound and has now been allowed to stop. She put her face against his neck. Her eyes were open, looking east. The reinforcements well. I arrived at 1400. The line held. The town behind the line had the morning it was supposed to have, which is to say, an ordinary morning with ordinary fear and no new fire, which in the Eastern Territories in this year is what ordinary means. The official report I obtained it eventually, through the specific combination of persistence and discomfort. That constitutes most, in my opinion, and of my professional methodology, credited the position's defense to Sergeant Kovalenko's effective fire discipline and the timely restoration of communications with battalion command. It mentioned basically, one else. I don't say this with outrage. Reports are documents. Documents have forms, and forms have categories. Daria Kovalenko didn't fit a category. Not enlisted, not civilian defense, not anything the form had a box for. She was a woman who drove 4 hours and drank tea and corrected for a lying scope, and then drove home. She drove home that evening. I, for what it's worth, watched the Lada go west. Back through the checkpoint, which the corporal opened without asking for papers. I pretty much stood at the checkpoint for a while after. The corporal was rubbing his jaw again. "She do what she came to do?" he asked. I thought about how to answer that. "So she visited her husband," I said. "He looked at me the way people look at you when they suspect you're being smart about something." I wasn't being smart. I meant it exactly. She visited her husband. Plus, everything else, I guess, was just what happened while she was there. I found her 3 weeks later in a city that had forgotten it was at war. Not forgotten. That's too easy. Too clean a word for what cities do with the knowledge of their own proximity to violence. They didn't forget, in which they metabolized it. The cafes were open. The grocery stores had gaps in their shelves where certain imported goods used to be, and regulars had learned to shop around the gaps the way you learn to walk around furniture in a house you've lived in long enough, without looking, without resentment, just rerouted. There were men in uniform in the cafes and men out of uniform, with the bearing of men who had been in uniform recently and hadn't yet redistributed their weight to civilian posture. There were children. There was a woman with a stroller arguing with a parking meter. The war was about 40 kilometers east, and it was also in the set of a man's shoulders at a bus stop. Both true, and I'd tracked her down the way I track everyone. Archive work, unit records, the specific archaeology of asking people questions they don't want to answer until someone answers. She was living in her mother's apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like boiled cabbage. The lavender soap that seems to be present in every Soviet-era building in this part of the world, as if it was specified in the original blueprints. I knocked. I waited. She opened the door and looked at me, looked at my notebook. "Press," she said. Not a question. "Which freelance?" I said. I was at the checkpoint. I was at the elevator. Something moved behind her eyes, and then stopped moving, like a fish that surfaces and reconsiders. She stepped back from the door. I took that for what it was and came in. The apartment was her mother's, in the way that rented rooms are the renters. Provisionally, temporarily, with the specific evidence of a person inhabiting a space that wasn't built to their dimensions. A military pattern bag in the corner. A coffee kind of cup that wasn't part of the apartment's set. Darker, wider, institutional. Books, kind of, on the kitchen table that weren't arranged so much as landed there. Her mother wasn't home. "Out," she said. "Fine, pretty much. The market." I sat at the kitchen table, and she made coffee without asking if I wanted any. 2 cups, which set one in front of me without looking. I liked her for that. Plus, I like people who solve problems before they announce them. "You want to write about it?" she said. "Yes." The basically shot. Among other things. She sat across from me with her coffee. She had the kind of face that's been rained on a specific number of times and has organized itself around that fact. Not hard, exactly, but finished in a way that younger faces aren't. There was a small scar at her left temple, barely visible, the kind that's been there long enough that the skin has accepted it as original architecture. She looked at my notebook. "You were watching," she said. "Oh, at the checkpoint." occupational hazard. What did you see? The question landed differently than I expected. She wasn't asking for flattery, and she wasn't asking what I'd thought of her. She was asking with the specificity of someone who wants to know what the record says, because the record matters to her in some way I didn't yet understand. I saw someone who had already made all the decisions before she got there, I said. She drank her, some coffee. That's one way to describe panic, she said. She talked in the way people talk when they've been waiting to talk and are simultaneously unconvinced they should. Slowly, which with pauses. With the occasional diversion into something adjacent, the specific weight of the canvas bag, the way the road east had changed since she'd last driven it, how the elevator's 5th floor smelled exactly like she remembered from her rotation there 2 years ago, which shouldn't have surprised her and did, and then back to the thing she was trying to say through the diversion. I didn't push. You don't push, and you make space and see what fills it. What filled it was this. She had known about the position under fire since the previous afternoon. Her husband had managed a 40-second transmission on the compromised radio, enough to establish that they were holding, that the situation was deteriorating at a rate that was calculable, or that he was currently uninjured. The connection dropped. She waited for another call. Another call didn't come. She had made the tea that night. Not because tea was called for, because her hands needed something to do that wasn't catastrophizing, and the specific ritual of heating water and measuring leaves and steeping and pouring is long enough, and requires just enough attention that it can function as an interruption to the part of the brain that's busy constructing scenarios in the dark. When she'd drunk 2 cups, stood at the kitchen window of this apartment, her mother's apartment, 4th floor, looking east at nothing in particular, since there wasn't thing to see. My mother went to bed at 10, she said. She said, "Go to sleep, Darya," which she said this like it was an option. She looked at her cup. I packed at midnight. I asked her about the discharge, the vertebral injury, the 11 months. I asked it carefully as I knew how to ask things, which is not always carefully enough, and I watched her face when I asked it to see if I'd overstepped. She didn't flinch, but something in her recalibrated. "What do you want to know?" she said. "What it was like," I said. "To stop." She considered this. "Like, in my opinion, a held note that cuts off," she said. "Not the end of the song, just the note stopping. And you're still." She moved her hand, a gesture that wasn't quite a word, which, in the room where the song was, but the note is gone. Her discharge hadn't been her choice. She'd appealed. The appeal process for medical discharge is, by design, a maze with no exit. You can walk it as long as you like, but the walls don't move. She walked it for 3 months. Filed the paperwork, took, the additional medical evaluations, presented the physiotherapy documentation, and was told each time, in different formulations, the same thing. The spine is not predictable enough, by which they meant, we can't risk what you cost us if you break in the field, by which she heard, we can't risk you. Which is funny, she said, because they'll risk me in every other direction. No bitterness in her voice when she said it. The honestly flatness again, the functional road. She'd walked that bitterness already. What remained was the landscape after. "Dmitro didn't ask me to come," she said. "In case you were going to ask. I'd been going to ask. Or I'd been. And she'd solved that problem before announcing it, same as the coffee. He didn't know I was coming," she said. "He didn't know I was—" She stopped. "Honestly, he didn't call me. He called battalion. The 40 seconds he had, he used on his chain of command." She said this with something that I couldn't name for a moment. Then I named it. Pride. She basically was proud of him for not calling her, for using the 40 seconds on the mission instead of on her. Because that was the right call, not tactically, and he'd made it. And she was sitting here drinking coffee in her mother's apartment 3 weeks later, partly because he'd made it. "If he'd called me," she said, "I'd have panicked." She looked at me. "The decision I made." She stopped again. Longer, which driving there. That was cold. That was calculated. If he'd called me, I'd have been responding to him, to his voice. And I'd have been. The hand again, the wordless gesture. So I'd have been a wife driving to a disaster. "Instead of," I said. "Instead of TBH, a sniper who happened to be driving to her husband. I want to write. Hear about the scope. Not the broken scope, I'll get to that, but her relationship to the instrument. To precision. Because I think that's the current running under the current. And I think if I don't write it now, I'll lose it in the recording of other things." She had been shooting since she was 19. Not military initially. Sport, on competitive, the regional circuit, then national, then the quiet knock on the door. That comes for people at that level who are, in the right country at the right historical moment. She had shot honestly in conditions that make marksmanship instructors write things in training manuals. Low light, variable wind, target acquisition under time pressure, suppressed equipment at long range. The spine, honestly, injury was from a fall. You know, not in the field. Not heroic. When she was descending a staircase in a forward operating base. ICE. So in the specific institutional negligence of a temporary structure that no one had prioritized because there was always something more pressing than maintaining stairs. And she went down the last 4 steps in a way that did the sort of micro damage that doesn't show up on initial imaging and doesn't announce itself until 6 weeks later when you're in a prone position on a concrete floor and you feel something in your lower back that has the quality of a word you can't remember. Important, but specific, gone. She told me this without self-pity. She told me about the imaging and the prognosis and the physio and the slow recovery with the same flat economy she used to describe everything. To be fair, facts. These were facts. But then she said, "The body remembers things differently from you." I looked up. "You, think you've healed," she said. "Your mind thinks it. Plus, the physiotherapist agrees. The paperwork says you've. And then you get back into position." She shifted in her chair, demonstrating without demonstrating the smallest possible index of what prone position means after a spinal injury. "And the body remembers what you're asking it to do. And it's not afraid, exactly. Which it's informed. It knows what the cost is in a way it didn't know before." She drank her coffee. "The scope was broken," I said. "And yes, that didn't, how do you recalibrate," she said. "You find out where the truth is relative to where the lie is, and you hold both at once." She said this like a simple thing. I wrote it down, which the thing she didn't tell me while she was telling me things, the thing I'd defined in the space between her sentences, was what it had cost her to walk into that elevator. Not the injury, not the recalibration, and the other thing. Fidenko, which Corporal Ivan Fidenko, the unit's qualified marksman, who was on the 3rd floor, being kept in the mostly here state by a field kit and a friend's hands. He was 23 years old. He was from Kherson. He had a younger sister who was studying accounting in a city that was now a different country for administrative purposes and unchanged in every personal one. He had, before he took the shrapnel that was meant for her husband, been a competent and composed shot who had probably saved several lives over the course of the morning. Signed, he was 23 years old, and he was bleeding on the 3rd floor, and she walked past him to get to the 5th. She didn't tell me this. Dimitro, pretty much, told me later, in Zaporizhzhia. He told me with the specific, careful neutrality of someone who's defending a decision that was the right decision and cost something, even being the right decision. She looked at him, Dmytro said. She TBH stopped for 1 second and she looked at him. Then she went upstairs. Was he look? I said. He made it, Dmytro said. Lost the eye. Made it! We sat with that. She knew that stopping would. Dmytro stopped. Tried again. The situation was what it was. The useful thing she could do was upstairs. Stopping wouldn't have helped him. It would haven't helped him, and also not helped us. He looked at his cast. She made the right call, he said. Then he said something I didn't write down because I thought at the time that I'd misheard him. I didn't misheard him. And he said, she's never going to forgive herself for it. You know? Not gonna lie, I asked her about that directly. The last question. The afternoon had gone dim around us. Her mother had come home from the market, made a small production of not knowing I was there, made tea anyway, brought it without asking, gone back to the other room. The apartment had the quality of a space that was holding several kinds of quiet. I asked her about Fidenko. She was quiet for a long time. He's alive, she said. Yes. Then I made the right call. I know. Quiet. I know, she said again. Different emphasis. Not agreeing with me. Explaining something to herself. Does I guess knowing help, I said. Her hands were around the tea her mother had brought. Sort of, she looked at them. Plus the same to be fair. Hands I'd watched move with automatic precision in a parking lot behind an outbuilding, loading the canvas bag, finding the documentation without fumbling. Still hands. The hands that well had held the truth and the lie simultaneously and shot through both. There are things you do, she said, that are correct. The way a calculation is correct. Plus, and basically, correct doesn't mean it. Doesn't leave a mark. She looked up. He was lying there, and I walked past him, she said. I'd do it again. I'd do it again every time. The situation was, I'd do it again. She put the tea down. I keep seeing his face, she said, when I stopped. That 1 second. What was on it? I said. He wasn't afraid, she said. Which he wasn't. He wasn't looking at me the way you look at someone when you need them to stay. He was. She stopped. She touched the scar at her temple. Automatic. She didn't know she did it. He looked at me the way my people look at each other when there's a job, she said. Why, he looked at me like, go. Like he understood exactly what the second I was wasting cost, and he was telling me to stop wasting it. She picked up the tea. He was 23, she said. He understood everything. I left before dinner. She didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't offer. At the door, you know, notebook under my arm, I asked her the question I'd been carrying since the checkpoint. The question I'd written and crossed out and written again. Well, why did you drive there yourself? I said. You could have. There were channels, which you could have contacted his commander. You could have filed a request for welfare identification. There were, I know what there were, she said. So why? Because he's my husband, she said. Because if there was something I could do, and I knew there was something I could do, I knew what I'd, and what I could offer, and I knew it was something. Then sitting here while someone else did it, or didn't do it, wasn't. She stopped. I couldn't, to be fair, be the thing that wasn't there, she said. I couldn't be the resource that wasn't used. She looked at me. I know what I cost, she said. The army has an opinion about what I cost. My spine has an opinion. Everyone has a calculation. I've one too. She touched the door frame. My calculation said to be fair. I go, she said. Plus, I walked down the 4 floors in the building that smelled like lavender soap. Outside, The city was doing what cities do in the evening near a war, filling itself with the particular determined brightness of people who are present, who are here, who are choosing the cafe and the argument about the parking meter and the child in the stroller against the alternative, which is the fourth floor and the window and the east. I stood on the pavement, opened my notebook, saw it looked, in my opinion, at everything I'd written. Something coming. She's not asking. His hands are shaking. Hers aren't. I think she knows. I turned to a new page, which wrote, "She calculated herself back in," then sat with whether that was the right way to say it. Well, it wasn't. But it was the closest I got. Plus, Fedenko got out of hospital in December. I found this out through Dimitro, who sent me a message that said only, "He's walking." He knows. I think basically, he knows meant that Fedenko had been told what happened, what she did, what the 1 second had looked like from the floor. I don't know what he felt about it. I hope I don't have to know. Some accountings are private. Daria's appeal was reinstated in February. I don't know yet what the second review will say. I don't know, in my opinion, if the mathematics of need has shifted enough to change the calculation that says the spine is not predictable enough. I don't know if they'll find the box for her on the form. I've my notebook. Plus, in it, on the page between the checkpoint and the elevator, in the handwriting I use when I'm writing fast, because something is happening that I don't want to lose, there's one line I haven't been able to put in any article or report or account. I've tried. It doesn't fit. It's not the sentence that goes in those places. But you know, it's the truest thing I wrote. She already knew what she was worth. She just had to go prove it to the building.